Something feels off right now, doesn't it? It's not always obvious, and it's not something that you can just put into words, but it's there. The world feels a little different. Conversations feel different, the way people react, the way people think, even the way people interact with each other. It feels like it's shifted somehow. And if you're part of Generation X, there's a good chance that you feel that shift more than most. Not because you're imagining it, and not because you're stuck in the past, but because you actually remember what things were like before all of this. All right, let's go.
Welcome to the Resistance.
3, 2, 1! 3, 2, 1!
Hey Xers, and welcome back to Gen X Resistance. I am your host, Paul Stevens, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to give the show a listen. You know, everyone talks about Gen X in a very specific way. We hear the same phrases over and over again. We drank from the hose. We rode our bikes until the streetlights came on. We were latchkey kids, independent, self-reliant, mostly left to figure things out on our own. And to be fair, most of that is true. There's a reason why those ideas come up so often. You see, they describe a real experience that shaped a lot of who we are. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized that those descriptions, while accurate, are also incomplete. They only tell part of the story, but they don't explain why our perspective feels so different today. What really sets Generation X apart isn't just how we grew up. It's that we didn't just grow up in one world. We lived through the transition between two completely different ones. We grew up in an analog world, and now we live in an algorithm-driven one. And that shift didn't just change technology. It didn't just give us new tools or new conveniences. It fundamentally changed how people interact with information, how they form opinions, and in many ways, how they think. When we were younger, information was pretty limited compared to today. There were only so many places that you could go to find it, a handful of television channels, a newspaper, maybe a few magazines. And if you really wanted to dig deeper, you had to go to the library. And that was the system at the time. And because of that, if you wanted to understand something, you actually had to put some effort into it. You had to go looking for it. You had to spend time with it. You had to think about it. There was no instant answer for everything. And that forced you to develop a certain level of patience and independence in how you process the world around you. That kind of environment naturally created space between information and reaction. You didn't immediately respond to everything because you couldn't. There was kind of a delay built into the system. You might read something in the paper, think about it for a while, maybe talk about it with someone later, and only then form an opinion. And sometimes you were wrong for a while. Sometimes you didn't have all the information. But that process of thinking, rethinking, and adjusting was part of how you learned. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It was independent thinking that shaped over time rather than dictated in that specific moment. Now, compare that to the world that we live in today. Today, you don't go looking for information nearly as much as information comes looking for you. It shows up in your feed. It's recommended to you. It's pushed through your notifications, through your headlines, videos, in the scrolling timelines. And while that might feel convenient, and in many ways it is, it also changes the relationship that you have with information itself. What you see isn't just what exists. It's what's selected for you based on what you've already shown interest in. And that's where the algorithm comes in. Your feed, your recommendations, your For You page, none of that is random. It's curated, it's filtered, it's designed to keep your attention. And the more you engage with it, the more it learns about you. It learns what you like, what you react to, what keeps you watching, what keeps you clicking. Over time, it builds this version of you based on your behavior, and then it feeds you back that same version in the form of content. At a certain point, something subtle but important begins to happen. You're no longer just choosing what you see. What you see is starting to influence how you choose. And eventually that line blurs so much that it becomes difficult to tell where your preferences end and where the system influence begins. That's a very different dynamic than how we grew up. See, back then, we were learning how the system worked, how we could use them. Today, the systems are learning how we work and how they can guide us. This is where a lot of that, uneasy feelings come from, especially for Gen X. See, it's not just nostalgia. It's not just missing the past. It's that awareness of the contrast. We remember a different place of life. We remember when boredom was a normal part of the day, not something that needed to be immediately filled. We remember when silence existed, when there wasn't a constant stream of input competing for our attention. We remember when not knowing something wasn't a problem that needed to be solved instantly. Today, everything moves faster. Everything is louder. Everything demands a reaction. There is very little space between seeing something and responding to it. And if you grew up in a slower, more analog environment, that constant pressure to react can feel unnatural. Not necessarily wrong, but definitely different. It's a shift in rhythm, and that rhythm affects how people think and behave. But the real shift goes even deeper than that. This isn't just about convenience or speed. It's about influence. When algorithms determine what people see, they also play a role in shaping what people believe, what they care about, what they think is important. And because it feels so personalized, because it feels like it's coming from a place of your own interest, it doesn't always feel like influence. It just feels like reality. That's where Gen X has a very unique perspective. We remember when information wasn't personalized to this degree. We remember when most people were exposed to the same general set of facts, the same headlines, the same broadcast. There was a shared baseline, even if people interpreted it differently. Today, that baseline is much more fragmented. Different people can be exposed to completely different streams of information, all tailored to their behavior, all reinforcing different perspectives. And that's a massive change. It affects how people communicate, how they disagree, how they understand the world around them. It's not just that people have different opinions, it's that they may be working from an entirely different set of information. And if you didn't live through the transition from one system to the other, it can be even harder to recognize that shift. And that's where Gen X is in such an interesting position. We didn't just hear about these changes, we experienced them. We saw the early days of home computers. We watched the internet go from something experimental to something essential. We adapted to emails, websites, search engines, social media, and smartphones. And now we're watching the rise of AI and the algorithm-driven system that's becoming even more integrated into our everyday life. At every stage, the tools changed, but the pattern stayed the same. Something new came along, we had to figure it out. There weren't always instructions. There wasn't always a clear path. We learned by doing, by experimenting, by making mistakes and adjusting as we went. That process of constant adaptation is a defining characteristic of our generation, even if it's not always recognized that way. And that's where the real advantage comes in. Generation X isn't just the generation that remembers what things used to be like. We're the generation that understands how things changed. We understand the difference between seeking information and being fed information. We understand the value of independent thought because we developed in an environment that required it. And at the same time, we understand how modern systems work because we've spent decades adapting to them. That combination is very rare. It creates a perspective that spans two very different worlds. It allows us to see both the benefits and the trade-offs of the technology that we use every day. It gives us context that can be easy to overlook if you've only ever known one version of the system. So the question isn't whether we miss the old days. It's not about going backwards or trying to recreate something that no longer exists. The real question is, what do we do with the perspective that we have now? What does that mean to understand both sides of this transition? What responsibility comes with that awareness? Because we've seen what was gained. We've also seen what was lost. And if we're paying attention, that puts us in a position to think more critically about where we're headed. Not from a place of fear or resistance to change, but from a place of understanding, from analog to algorithm. This wasn't just a shift in tools, it was a shift in how reality is experienced and interpreted. And Generation X lived through the shift in real time. That's not just a nostalgic footnote, it's a meaningful perspective. All right, I'm Paul Stevens, and this is Gen X Resistance. Look, if this resonated with you, make sure you follow or subscribe wherever you may be listening, whether that's YouTube or on whatever podcast platform that you prefer. All right, until next time, keep thinking for yourself. And most importantly, stay rad, my friends.